But we're going to pick up where we left off last week in the book of Leviticus. Turn to chapter 11, if you will. That's where we will resume our study of this fascinating book. Leviticus, all full of laws, customs, rituals, all the things that the Israelites had to do to try to maintain purity and communicate with God and reflect who He is. All the things that we say, well, that doesn't really apply to us today. And in a sense, that's true because we're not under the system anymore. We've been rescued from that system when Christ came and died for us. And yet we can still see a lot about who God is and learn a lot from this book. We talked last week mostly about the sacrificial system. And this was a system that God gave the Israelites as a means of their communication back to Him. Of course, they didn't have the Holy Spirit back then in the same way that we do. The veil had not yet been torn, so there was definitely a division and a gap between the people and God. We, of course, today can just go and pray to God and come into His presence and communicate with Him anytime we want. And I think we take that for granted in huge, huge ways because we're so used to it. But back then, it was not that way. And so God gave the Israelite nation a way that they could respond back to Him and communicate, like I said, almost like a kind of a coded system last week, didn't we? He gave them a series of sacrifices that they could offer, and the different sacrifices stood for different things. You had the burnt offering and the thank offering and the sin offering, the guilt offering, and all the different offerings that meant different things. And so when the people wanted to convey a certain sentiment to God, they would bring this offering, and they would sacrifice it before, or the priest would sacrifice it for them before God in a prescribed way. And they could give this message to God, and God would accept their sacrifice, assuming they did everything in the proper manner. Of course, if they didn't do things in the proper manner, we saw what happened last week, didn't we? People were all excited after the first grand sacrifice, and two of the priests, Nadab and Abihu, decided, hey, this is so fun, we want to keep this going. God is loving what we're doing, the people are loving what we're doing, and so they decided to throw something else on the fire or offer something in some way that wasn't correct. And the Bible doesn't really say what wasn't correct about it. It's not really important. But they were presumably caught up in the excitement or got sloppy or lazy or whatever the case was, and they decided to do something that wasn't prescribed. And once again, fire came out from God and consumed something too, didn't it? But it wasn't the sacrifice, it was the priest that did it. And we said, well, this is a good system. It's better communication for the people than what they had before, but there was a flaw in that. As long as we're relying on fallen, flawed human priests, we have a potential difficulty in reaching God because our communication, our sacrifices have to go through this priest. And if the priest doesn't do what he's supposed to do, that link of communication and that relationship is broken. Oh, wouldn't it be nice if we could have a perfect, forever priest that could represent us before God, who we didn't need to worry about corruption or some kind of infidelity to the system, that he could always offer this sacrifice to God, and we could always be in that communication with Him. But where do you find a priest like that? They just don't make high priests like that. Well, of course, we have one these days, and again, I think we take that for granted. We also talked about intentional versus unintentional sin. We kind of went through a list of several that Leviticus lists out for us. And it's not so much that the sin itself or the act itself is unintentional, but the rebellion that represents before God was unintentional. I didn't really mean to shake my face in God's face this way. That wasn't what I was trying to do. I just got caught up, or my human nature got the best of me. And so I'm going to offer the sacrifice to atone and cover for that sin that I didn't mean to be rebellion, but I know it was now, and looking back on it, I shouldn't have done what I did. So here's a sacrifice to try to cover for that. Now, if you do something that is intentionally and openly rebellious against God, where you look at God and you say, I know this is wrong, but I don't care, I'm doing what I want to anyway, there is no sacrifice for that situation. You're to be cut off from your people. And so that's where we ended last week, at the end of chapter 10. We're going to continue this week into chapter 11 through 16 is the next section we're going into. This next section here is not so much about sacrifices or forgiveness or atonement, but in contrast to that system, this next section gives a set of regulations that deal with clean versus unclean, mostly. These are not sins as we think of them. In other words, not a sin per se to become unclean, and I'll read you some of these examples in a minute, although they are regulations from God. So if you become unclean and fail to follow what God says to do about your uncleanness, that would be a sin. There's very little sacrifice, there's very little bloodshed, or even restitution required in this section here. Only washing, inspecting, renewing to become clean again. God had a whole big long system and set of regulations and requirements for the people to remain clean before him. And if you weren't clean, you couldn't come to the temple, and you couldn't offer sacrifices, and you couldn't participate in the festivals. All these things that were so important to the Judaistic system of worship here as God is instituting it. You have to be clean before God before you can participate. So you want to remain clean all the time. I want to read through a couple passages of these, example passages of this system of clean and unclean. And as I do it, I want everybody to try to put yourself in the sandals of the Israelites at this time. Try to picture what it would be like for you to live under this system. Now, if you find yourself unclean, and say Sunday rolls around, to put it in our vernacular here, Sunday comes around and you're unclean, guess what you can't do? You can't come to church. You're kind of excluded. You have to stay home because you're unclean. And to approach God, now the church is not the temple, just so everybody here and everybody online understands. Church is not the temple. God doesn't live in the church building now like he was present in the tabernacle or temple back then. Make that clear. But I'm just trying to make an analogy here. If you want to come and visit God at church, you have to be clean, and if you're not clean, you have to stay home until you become clean, and then you can rejoin the assembly and come to church and participate in all the things. And so put yourself in the shoes or in the sandals of the Israelites back then as we go through a few examples of the clean and unclean requirements that God presents in this passage. Chapter 11 deals mostly with food and animals and clean and unclean foods. I won't read most of it to you, but let me read just a little snip here, starting in verse 29 of chapter 11. It says, "And these," talking about these animals, "are unclean to you among the swarming things that swarm on the ground." So he's already covered the mammals and the livestock and all the other stuff. This is clean and that's unclean. Now we're talking about other things, swarming things, bugs, basically. These things are unclean to you among swarming things that swarm on the ground. The mole rat, and vermin apparently. Mole rat, the mouse, the great lizard of any kind, the gecko, the monitor lizard, the sand lizard, and the chameleon. Okay, those are unclean to you. These are unclean to you among all that swarm. Whoever touches them when they are dead shall be unclean until the evening. And anything on which any of them falls when they are dead shall be unclean, whether it is an article of wood, or a garment, or a skin, or a sack, or any article that is used for that purpose. So if you touch one of these critters, you're unclean until evening. Or if you have something else and a little gecko lizard falls on your backpack or whatever it is, guess what? Your backpack is now unclean until evening. It must be put into water, and it shall be unclean until the evening, and then it shall be clean. So you have to wash it off and then wait till evening. Verse 33, "And if any of them falls into any earthenware vessel, all that is in the vessel shall be unclean, and you shall break it." So if it falls into your pot of soup, and that pot of soup is a ceramic pot, guess what? Your soup is unclean, plus you have to break your pot and buy a new one. Verse 34, "Any food that's in it that could be eaten, on which water comes, shall be unclean, and all drink that could be drunk from every such vessel shall be unclean. And everything on which any part of their carcass falls shall be unclean. Whether oven or stove, it shall be broken in pieces. They are unclean and shall remain unclean for you. Nevertheless, a spring or a cistern holding water shall be clean, but whoever touches a carcass in them shall be unclean." So if you go to the well to draw up some water, the water's okay, but if you touch a lizard or a mole rat that has fallen into the well and you touch it, then you're unclean. "And if any part of their carcass falls upon any seed grain that is to be sown, it is clean. But if water is put upon the seed, and any part of their carcass falls on it, it is unclean to you." Everybody got all that straight? Do we need to go through this again? Should we make up a flow chart here? Maybe bullet points, something like that? Everybody okay? You got all that in your head? Because these are things you have to pay attention to. Watch out for those mole rats and those geckos. They'll get you. And if you touch them, you're out of commission for the day. You're unclean until evening. And that's assuming you do all the washing and drying and all the stuff and putting it away. And if it falls in the pot, you have to break it and make a new one. And if it falls in your oven or stove, oh dear, if you're outside cooking in your outside stone oven or whatever it is you have, and one of those lizards walks up on it, bad news for you. It's time to start checking out a new oven at Lowe's or something like that, okay? All right, continuing on. That type of thing is what chapter 11 is full of. Chapter 12 is purification after childbirth for women in particular. And it talks about if you have a baby, you're unclean for a certain period of time, and if it's a boy, you're unclean for this long, but if it's a girl, you're unclean for that long, and either way, you have to do this certain procedure and that certain ritual to make yourself clean again after a certain time. And like I said, if it's a boy, I think you're unclean for basically a month. If it's a girl, you're unclean for 2 months, and you have to do all the different things that you have to do there. Chapter 13 and 14 talk about leprosies and mildews and infections. A lot of this is just a little bit gross. I'm not even going to read through it because it's kind of disgusting. Chapter 13 in particular, if you've got rashes and oozy things and scaly things and type of things, but you find one of these things on you, now you have to go to the priest and you have to get inspected, and he has to do certain things. You have to wait so long, you have to go back and get re-inspected, and if it's this, then you're okay, but if it's not that, you're not okay. And then you have to shave your head, and you have to shave your arms, and you have to spin around 3 times and click your heels and say no place like home, and all the different things you have to do to become clean ritually once again. Okay? Check out chapter 13, verse 40. Now, if a man's hair falls out from his head, he is bald, he is clean. And all the guys in here say, Amen. Thank you. And if a man's hair falls out of his forehead, he has baldness of the forehead, and he is still clean. Again, we say, yeah, very good. Verse 42, but if there is on the bald head or the bald forehead a reddish-white diseased area, it is a leprous disease breaking out on his bald head or his bald forehead. Then the priest shall examine him, and if the diseased swelling is reddish-white on his bald head or on his bald forehead, like the appearance of a leprous disease in the skin of the body, he is a leprous man, and he is unclean. The priest must pronounce him unclean. The disease is on his head. The leprous person who has the disease shall wear torn clothes and let the hair of his head hang loose, and he shall cover his upper lip and cry out, unclean, unclean, and he shall remain unclean as long as he has the disease. He is unclean, he shall live alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp. So you wake up one day and you see a little rash on your forehead, and you say, oh no, I'm already starting to go bald, now what? And so you have to go get inspected by the priest, and the priest has to check you out, and if he says you're fine, but if not, you got to leave your family, leave your house, and go outside. Hopefully this thing gets better, and you can come back into camp, but if not, I just live out here, and I've lost my family and my home, and now, I don't know what's going on. Of course, we've heard stories in the New Testament of the leprous people, Jesus goes out and heals them and stuff like that. The leper camps outside of the camp, so this type of thing didn't spread. But man, every time you get a rash now, you have to worry, how long am I going to be unclean? I hope the priest gives me a good report, because I certainly don't want to have to leave camp and go outside. And if I do, I hope it's like a temporary thing, and maybe it'll go away and I can come back in. But if not, what do I do? How long till I can become clean before God and not just lose my family and my house, but now I don't get to participate in all the things that make me Jewish, going to the festivals and the sacrifices and all these things that I can't do now because I'm too unclean. I'm not allowed to approach God in this condition. Chapter 14 continues on about talking about cleaning lepers. And then in verse 33 it talks about the houses, right? If you get up one day and you see some mold growing on the wall, oh no, you can't just get out a washcloth and clean it off. What do you have to do? Well, again, you have to go to the priest, and the priest has to come out to your house, and he has to inspect your house. And if it looks like it's a spreading thing below the surface, then he chips some off, and then they close up the house for 7 days, and they have to come back and re-inspect later. And if it's gone away, fine, but if not, you have to tear out that stone and throw it away and replace it. And if it still comes back again, the priest has to come back out again. And if it's spread even more, then they have to tear your entire house down. And guess what? You're building yourself a new home out of new rocks, because all the old ones have been taken outside the camp and burned. And now you have to build a whole new house, and you're starting from scratch, and it's a whole great big ordeal. And it's just a great big mess, and it's long, and it's involved, and it's frustrating. Chapter 15 then talks about, I think on the slide I've called it sexual uncleanness, and maybe I kind of shouldn't have put that title. I'm not talking about immorality here. I'm just talking about things that bodies do from time to time. Ladies, you probably have an idea what I'm talking about here. We're talking about every month or so things happen, and what do? Well, when that happens, you're unclean for a period of time, and you have to do certain things, and you have to go through this ritual and all the things. Guys, your bodies do things too. I'll let you read it for yourself. I don't want to go into it, but read up for yourself what you'd have to do when this happens, when that happens, and you have to become clean again. All these different requirements that you have to do, so many different conditions. and fulfillments that you have to comply with in order just to be clean enough to go back and to have communion with God and communion with the camp and be in fellowship, participate in the festivals and the sacrifices and all the things that are so important and so central to that community. Now, I said at the beginning of this section, put yourself in the sandals of the Israelite at this time, and you are living under the system. What do you think about the system? What do you see from the system? What do you learn about the system or about God or about yourself by living under these conditions? I won't take hands necessarily because we're in the auditorium, I understand this, but put yourself in their place. What do you see? Well, how does it make you feel? Probably makes you feel like, wow, I spend so much of my time and efforts becoming unclean and then trying to become clean again. It is so hard for me. It's virtually impossible for me to stay clean before God. I just can't do it. I mean, I'm a grungy little Joe Q Israelite here walking around in the wilderness, living out of my tent, and there's lizards and mice all around in this forsaken wilderness we have to walk through, and there's always something crawling up in my oven or falling into my pot, or I'm always getting some rash from walking around in the rain here trying to pick up manna every morning, and I'm always unclean. There's always something going on. I can never become clean before God. Not really. And it's so frustrating. And it's such a hassle. I'm so tired of trying to be clean. I'm so tired of being dirty all the time. I'm tired of being excluded. And when I'm dirty, I can't approach God because He's so holy enough. He won't really tolerate gross, unclean things coming into His house, which is understandable. But I am one of those gross, unclean things too much of the time. And when I'm clean, that's great. I can go in and fellowship and be in God's presence. But I'm so dirty compared to who God is. God's so holy and perfect and clean, and it really makes me see myself as somebody who's kind of unworthy and kind of dirty and unclean. I'm not sure I like myself all that much a lot of the time because I'm so filthy. Is that a fair summary? That's how I would feel if I was under that system. And I don't know if you would too, but this is so frustrating, so arduous. And it's so impossible for me to be clean before God. But there is good news. There is good news coming up because while all of these laws make the Israelites just absolutely sick and tired of being perpetually unclean, God does provide them with at least a partial solution, doesn't He? And that's what we find in chapter 16. Chapter 16 tells us about Atonement Day. The Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, right? The holy day of the year. And while none other day of the year can the priest himself even go into the holiest of holies to approach the Ark of the Covenant, to be in God's closest proximity of presence and get to visit with Him. On this day, this one day of the year, the priest gets to do this. And so he brings a sacrifice for himself to atone for himself. He brings sacrifices to atone for the temple as a whole, or temple, I keep saying tabernacle at this point. Tabernacle as a whole. And so he sanctifies and purifies it. Then they offer sacrifices for the entirety of the Israelite community. And again, we'll not read through all the ritual that goes on and takes place there. You can read that for yourself if you wish. But in verse 29, it kind of sums it up. It says, "And it shall be a statute for you forever, that in the 7th month, on the 10th day of the month, you shall afflict yourselves." And that doesn't mean like beat yourselves over the head with a hammer. Okay, it's talking about fasting here. Probably some of your translations say fasting, I'm going to guess. But you shall fast, you shall afflict yourselves, and shall do no work, neither the native nor the stranger who sojourns among you. For on this day shall atonement be made for you to cleanse you, and you shall be clean before the Lord from all of your sins. It is a Sabbath of solemn rest to you, and you shall afflict yourselves, again fasting. It is a statute forever, and the priest who is anointed and consecrated as priest in his father's place shall make atonement, wearing the holy linen garments. And he shall make atonement for the holy sanctuary, and he shall make atonement for the tent of meeting and for the altar, and he shall make atonement for the priests and for all the people of the assembly. And this shall be a statute forever for you, that atonement may be made for the people of Israel once in the year because of all of their sins. And Aaron did as the Lord commanded Moses. So once a year, there is this glorious day, the Day of Atonement, where everybody is made clean just like that. And the priest goes in and he offers his sacrifices and he does his ritual, and everybody is clean. And everybody is atoned for. And everybody can come to the tabernacle and worship with God and be together and meet in the assembly of everybody who's coming to do this. Once a year, you get to be clean. What a relief that would be. I'm dirty, I'm unclean again, but I know next Sabbath day, in like 3 or 4 days, is coming up. I will get to be clean. And I don't have to worry about it. I can't wait till Atonement Day. And Atonement Day comes. I'm clean. And everybody gets to come and be together and worship together and enjoy being together. And it's a holy day. And what a wonderful feeling that would be. So yes, once a year the priest could enter the Holy of Holies and make atonement for all of Israel by killing the sacrificial goat and removing Israel's sins by placing them on a scapegoat. And then everyone could be clean and forgiven of their sins. Wouldn't that be fantastic? Can you imagine what a relief that would be on Atonement Day? And everybody says, what? I hear some amens. Probably I'd say yay myself. But if you're more sophisticated than me, I guess you could say amen. That's fine too. But it's a great thing. It's a wonderful thing. And everybody's clean and come before God and they can be in His presence the way that we'd all like to be. But there's one problem, isn't there? What's the one problem? You go to bed, and the next day, what happens? Another stupid lizard falls in your soup pot, and you're back to breaking pots again. And little Susie wakes up, and she's got a rash on her arm. We've got to go see the priest. And as you're walking out the door, you see some creepy little black mold above your door, and you got to say, well, I've got to go see the priest anyway. I might as well call him out to see if we have to destroy our house or not. That's great. So on Atonement Day, everybody's clean and everything is fantastic. But what? Until what? Until tomorrow. And the cleanness only lasts for such a short time. And all of a sudden, the next day, we're back to being unclean again. I'm so tired of being unclean. And Atonement Day was so wonderful. I don't have to worry about being unclean before God. And I could approach Him and have fellowship on all the great things. But now I'm unclean again. Wouldn't it be wonderful? Wouldn't it be fantastic if what? Wouldn't it be fantastic if I could always be permanently clean before God? What if I could just go and visit and talk with Him anytime I wanted? And I don't have to worry about stupid lizards and mildew and rashes and all this kind of garbage. I can always be clean before Him, and I can always approach Him, and He'll never say, get away from me. You're restricted. You're unclean. Go make yourself ceremonially clean before you come back to me. I would always be clean. And I don't have to worry about all this. I can be atoned for. I can be clean. I can be forgiven once and for all. Wouldn't that be something if we could have, first of all, a high priest who could do this, who wasn't corruptible, and who wouldn't break the rules, and who my link with God would never be broken, and I could be always clean all the time. Every day could be Atonement Day. Can you imagine what that would be like? In the meantime, however, I guess we better go wash in the creek again because I'm unclean once again. And I'll be unclean for the next week until the priest gives me the A-OK that I can go back and be clean. And then another lizard will crawl on my oven again. We'll be back to it. So what does this system do? It provides a way of cleansing, but it also does what? It forces the people to realize there has to be something, what? Something more. There has to be a better way. There has to be a better way that I can come before God. But God is so holy, He's so perfect. And I'm so not holy, not perfect. How could there possibly be a way to bridge the gap between me and Him? I can't think of a way. I just don't know how it could be. And again, we today are so fortunate. We know the answer to that because we have the answer to that. And I think we take for granted that so very, very often. But put yourself in the shoes of the Israelites at this time. So Atonement Day is a fantastic thing, but it also is a very temporary and very limited thing because that atonement is so very, very short-lived. Brings us to chapter 17. Chapter 17 through 22, then, contains various laws of holiness for the Israelites to observe. But why should the Israelites even care about being holy? Again, I will not read through all of these laws. There's a lot of dietary laws here. There's a lot of sexual restrictions going on in chapter 18. A lot of just societal, behavioral type things going on. Again, just kind of a quickie example here of the different things. Chapter 19, verse 11, you shall not steal, you shall not deal falsely, you shall not lie to one another, you shall not swear by my name falsely, and so profane the name of the Lord your God. I am the Lord. You shall not oppress your neighbor or rob him. The wages of a hired worker shall not remain with you all night until the morning. You have to pay your employees every day. You shall not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block before the blind. If you curse the deaf, what? They can't hear it. They don't even know what you're saying. They're completely unaware and they can't defend themselves in any way. Or you shouldn't put a stumbling block before the blind. I mean, it's not nice to do that to regular people either, but especially the blind because they can't see what is before them. Again, you put them in a helpless position. But you shall fear the Lord your God. I am the Lord. Keeping his statutes, punishment for child sacrifices and idolatry, more punishments for sexual immoralities, holiness of the priests. He continues on here. Chapter 22 continues with offerings and other different things. All through these chapters, and you can read all the laws and restrictions that they were to follow. But why even do all this stuff? What is the impetus for doing all of this? What's the motivation? Why? And there's a phrase that's repeated throughout this section over and over and over, and it's not hard to find. In fact, if I wanted to go back to chapter, pick a chapter here, start in 19. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to all the congregation of the people of Israel, and say to them, you shall be holy for what? Why are they to be holy? Why are they to care? The people are to be holy because, what does the verse say at the end of verse 2? Because I, the Lord your God, am holy, and you are to represent me. Every one of you shall revere his mother and his father, and you shall keep my Sabbaths. Then it says, what? Here's a reminder, because I am the Lord your God. That is your reason. Verse 4, do not turn to idols or make for yourselves any gods of cast metal. I am the Lord your God. I am the Lord, I am the Lord, I am the Lord. Repeated so many times. I have a partial list up there. Oh, no, I don't. Not quite yet, do I? I'm still on the previous screen. Anyway, yeah. Chapter 20, verse 26 kind of repeats the same concept here where it says, you shall be holy to me, for I, the Lord, am holy. That is why you are to be holy. And I've separated you from the peoples that you should be mine. Look at just a partial record of some of these verses where it said, for I am the Lord. Chapter 18, verse 2. Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, I am the Lord your God. You shall not do as they did in the land of Egypt where you lived. You shall not do as they did in the land of Canaan where I'm bringing you. You shall not walk in their statutes. You shall follow my rules and keep my statutes and walk in them. I am the Lord your God. Therefore, because of that, you shall keep my statutes and my rules. If a person does them, they shall live by them. I am the Lord. None of you shall approach any of his close relatives to uncover his nakedness. I am the Lord. And he goes on with all the restrictions and the rules, and he always follows up with, I am the Lord. Chapter 18, verses 2, 4, 5, 6, 21, 30, and there are more, by the way. This is not a complete list. Chapter 19, verses 2, 3, 12, 14, 28, 30, 31, 32, 34, 36, and there are more. Chapter 20, verses 7, 8, 24, 26, and there are more. Do this, I am the Lord. Do that, I am the Lord. Do this other thing, I am the Lord. I am the God that brought you out. You are not to do what the Egyptians did, where you came from. You're not to do what the Canaanites do, where you're going to. They follow the false gods. You are to represent me before the other people. Looking at you as how all the other nations are to see who I am, and your behavior is to be a reflection of who I am to them. Therefore, you are to be holy, you're to be orderly, you're to be conscientious before people, you're to love the Lord your God with all your heart, you're to love your neighbor as yourself, you're to do all these things that I'm commanding you to because I am the Lord. And your job is to be a good representation of who I am so that all the other nations can see what I am like by the way you behave. I am the Lord, he says. How well did they perform? Unfortunately, we know from scriptural history they did not perform very well. In fact, by the time of the prophets, they are behaving so badly that the prophets say, you're behaving worse than the nations that you replaced. The nations of Canaan that I kicked out of the land because they're evil, you're being even worse than they were. They would look back at you and say, wow, we were bad, but we weren't as bad as you guys. You guys are horrible. That's the kind of representation they were giving God. That was God's testimony as far as the people were concerned. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out why God said, I got to exile you guys. I'm not going to put up with it anymore because you're making my reputation and my testimony look like garbage to everybody else. I got to get rid of you guys because I'm not going to put up with this. For my own name's sake, I will not put up with this. You guys got to go. But this is the motivation here. I am the Lord, and you're to follow all of my laws so that you represent who I am to all the other nations around. I am the Lord. Everybody okay? Everybody good? Everybody go, whew. Yeah, okay, catch your breath. Here we go. I think we're going to get through Leviticus today, by the way. Everybody, all right, we're going to do it. The next section, chapter 17 through 25. No, I'm sorry, I take that back. Chapter 23 and 24, within that big section, talks about the feasts and the festivals and all the different things that they are to observe. And again, we'll not go through these in great detail. I did put a chart up here on the screen just so you can look if you want to. The 6 main festivals that are listed here on this chart. You got the Passover, which is in the first month from the 14th to 21st days, reminds them of their redemption from Egypt. God says, I brought you up out of Egypt. I rescued you. I made you a nation. You owe your existence to me. Do not forget this. Do not forget what I have done to you. And when we went through the book of Exodus, we already talked about the symbolism of the whole blood over the door thing and everything that goes with that, and the redemption and the blood sacrifice. And we won't go through all that again. So they are to re-perform this every year at the specific time. The blood, the door, the going inside, the bitter herbs, the roasting the lamb over the fire, don't break any bones. All that kind of thing is to be repeated. And it reminds them of their redemption of Egypt. It reminds them of how they owe everything, including their existence, to God, how he rescued them and saved them and brought them out. And it also, like I said, implants the notion, the seed idea in their mind of this blood redemption and passing through the blood and being rescued in that way. You have the festival of the first fruits. That's the time of the first harvest. They are to bring in the first sampling of the first thing they harvest out of the field. They are to bring in before God. Commentators that I read say this would have been like barley, because that's about the time that it would have been getting ripe. Nothing else would have been ripe yet. So they're not to partake or eat of any of this crop until they bring the first of it into God and offer this sacrifice and hold this festival, and then they can partake of the crop that they have started to bring in. What's the point? Well, it's about thankfulness and an anticipation of the crop to come. And God said, as long as you follow my laws, I will bless you. I'll make your crop so great. You'll have plenty of food. Things will be wonderful as long as you follow my laws. And so you are to bring the first fruits. The very first thing you collect out of your fields is mine. And if you're worried about a bad summer or a drought coming up or something like that, the very first of that food coming in after you've been living off of last year's crop all year, that's a valuable thing to you. Will I collect more? Will it hail or rain or flood or storm or drought out the rest of my crop and I don't get any more? Well, the first of it you offer to God in faith that he will keep his word and bring the rest of your crop to you, and also thankfulness for the crop that you know he will be giving to you. So it's thankfulness, anticipation, trust, and confidence that God will provide for you the way that he said he would. Then you have the next one there. It's in yellow. It's a little harder to see, isn't it? Yeah. The Feast of Weeks, Pentecost, 50 days afterwards. This is towards the end of the crop season. And again, you bring in these crops, you have this festival and thankfulness for what God has provided for you. Again, it's a time of rejoicing, of celebration, of gratefulness for God's provision. Then you have the Feast of Trumpets. This happens on the 7th month on the first day, a celebration and anticipation of the atonement, because on the 7th month, the 10th day, just a little bit later, is our favorite holiday, the Day of Atonement. Yes, clean day, when everybody has become clean. All about forgiveness and cleansing before God, and God setting everything right on this one day of the year. Wipes the slate clean of all the sins and all the uncleanness of the entire congregation, and everybody can come and be restored. And then finally, the Feast of Tabernacles, pretty much directly after the Day of Atonement. And this is also celebration, memorial of the tents that they lived in as they are going through the wilderness, which probably would have been current day at this time. at the time it was written, but he says this is to be a everlasting memorial to you. When you get into the land of Canaan, you're set up in your houses and everything's comfortable. For this week out of every year, you are to go build a little tent out in the backyard and sleep in that tent for a week as a reminder of your wandering in the wilderness, that time of punishment when God had to punish you for your disobedience standing on the banks of the Jordan. He had to destroy an entire generation of Israelites because of this. But you need to memorialize this, to remind yourself of this. God kept you safe. He provided for you at that time. But also it's a reminder not to disobey God because he will have to punish you. So it's kind of a somber but also a memorial time as well. That brings us to chapter 25. The first 7 verses of chapter 25 talks about the sabbatical year. For 6 years they are to do their crops and harvest and all that kind of thing, provide for themselves. But on the 7th year, they are to not plant anything at all. They are supposed to let the land just kind of sit, and they're to eat off of what kind of just grows naturally and or whatever they had left before. But they are to let the land sit. Of course, we know again from biblical history they didn't do this very well, and that's one of the many reasons that God gives when he exiles them centuries later. He says, you haven't been letting the land get its Sabbath rests, therefore I will exile you for 70 years, 1 year for every sabbatical year that you did not give the land. You've overworked it. I told you to give it rest. You refused to do so. So now I will force rest upon the land because I'm going to get rid of you, all you guys, and there will be nobody to farm the land left anymore. And it will finally get its rests for everything it deserves. And so they are to take a rest year every 7th year. How'd you like that? I think that sounds not so bad. Every 7th year you get the entire year off. How's that sound? Yay! Get to sleep in for a year, no plowing, no harvesting, and don't have to get the tractor out at all. You might want to change the oil just so it doesn't get all rusty, but you don't have to go out and do any crops for an entire year. That'd be kind of nice. On the other hand, you spent 6 years cultivating and getting rid of all the weeds and pruning everything just right through the 6th year, and then the 7th year comes up, and now what happens? All the weeds come back during the sabbatical year, and all the grapevines are no longer pruned, and all the plants and all the crops, the fields are becoming overgrown. You kind of have to start all over again the next year because everything is just overgrown with all the weeds and stuff. Now you have to start all over. So it's kind of a nice thing and kind of a not nice thing, and all kinds of lessons that we can learn from that again I won't go into because of time. But in verse 8 of chapter 25 talks about the ultimate Sabbath year, doesn't it? It's called the year of Jubilee. What a fascinating year. 7 Sabbaths go by, and then the year of Jubilee shows up. In chapter 25, verse 8, it says, you shall count 7 weeks of years, or 7 sets of 7 years. 7 times 7 years, so that the time of the 7 weeks of years shall give you 49 years. Then you shall sound the trumpet on the 10th day of the 7th month. On the Day of Atonement you shall sound the trumpet throughout your land, and you shall consecrate the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you, when each of you shall return to his property, and each of you shall return to his clan. That 50th year shall be a jubilee for you. In it you shall neither sow or reap what grows for itself, or gather grapes of the undressed vines, for it's a jubilee. It shall be holy to you. You may eat the produce of the field. Verse 13, in this year of jubilee, each of you shall return to his property. And if you make a sale to your neighbor or buy from your neighbor, you shall not wrong one another. You shall pay your neighbor according to the number of years after the Jubilee. And he shall sell to you according to the number of years for crops. If the years are many, you shall increase the price, and if the years are few, you shall reduce the price. For it's the number of the crops that he is selling to you. You shall not wrong one another, but you shall fear the Lord your God. And here's the phrase we've seen throughout, for I am the Lord your God. Here's how it shall be. At every 50th year on this year of Jubilee is the great reset. Nobody in Israel actually sells their lands technically on a permanent basis. They really lease it is what they're doing. They say, we have 23 years until the next Jubilee. Therefore, I will sell you 23 years worth of use of my land. But on that year of Jubilee, after 23 years, it's my field again. It comes back to me. And so if you're on year 49 out of 50, you have 49 more years to go because you just had Jubilee last year, land's going to be expensive because you get to have it for that long. But if you have Jubilee next year, it's going to be super cheap because after this year, it goes back to the original owner. And in this way, well, for one thing, in this way, God's division of land between the tribes stays constant. Not everything doesn't get all mishmashed back together. Everything resets to the way that he prescribed the land to be divided. But also, as you can see up there, every 50th year was to celebrate the year of Jubilee. It's a time of freedom, restoration, and rest. No matter how badly the Israelites messed up their lives, the Jubilee resets everything in a grand display of God's forgiveness, mercy, and love for his people. Not only does the land revert back to the original owners, slaves who were bought or sold gain their freedom. They are set free in that year. And so slavery, and slavery is another topic, but if you were to buy a slave, and in 2 years of Jubilee, you only have him for those 2 years, and then he used to be set free, and all the slaves are freed, and everyone is to go back to the land. It's a great, great reset. God hits the reset button and say, I don't care how bad you messed up your life, if you squandered things, you were careless, you were reckless, you lost everything. You had to sell yourself and your children into indentured servitude just to survive, and you're now working for somebody, and you're indentured to them, and you are their slave. On this year of Jubilee, everything is reset. You're put back to square one. You can go back to your land, which you get back, even if you lost everything. You get it all back. You get your freedom back. Everything is reset in this grand reset of the year of Jubilee. And God restores everything to, can we call it perfection? It's not, you know what I mean. It's not perfection. But everything is restored back to before the mistakes were made. And those who have lots and lots and lots of stuff, they are able to give back. Those who have lost everything, they receive back what is theirs as well. And everything is reset. And what an amazing picture of this restoration that God provides for his people. And yes, there are consequences if you're foolish or you're sloppy with your finances or money or family or property or whatever it is. And you have to live with that for a long time. I mean, 50 years is a long time. For many people, this will be a once-in-a-lifetime event. But in that once-in-a-lifetime event, God resets everything, and everything is set back in a beautiful display of his love and mercy and forgiveness and resetting and restoration for his people. And we can see that in the year of Jubilee. Well, that brings us almost to the end of the book. Chapter 26, then, we see kind of a reminder of how seriously God takes all these things that he has commanded. In chapter 26, we see blessings for obedience. Verse 3 says, if you walk in my statutes and observe my commands and do them, all these things that I've told you to do, then I will give you rains in their seasons, and the land will yield its increase, and the trees of the field will yield their fruit. Your threshing shall last to the time of the grape harvest, and the grape harvest shall last to the time of sowing. In other words, it will take you so long to bring in the harvest, you'll still be harvesting because you have so much grain that the planters will be coming up behind you and say, hey, get out of the way. It's time for us to plant again. And you'll say, but I'm still harvesting last year's crop. We had so much grain. It's just taken all this time to harvest it. We have so much food because God has provided so much. It takes so long for us to harvest. It's time to plant again before we even get in last year's crop. And the same for the vines. You'll still be picking grapes when it's time to start pruning the grapevine for next year. You'll have so much abundance if you obey my words and my commands. And you shall eat your bread to the full and dwell in your land securely. And I will give peace in the land, and you shall lie down, and none shall make you afraid. And I'll remove the harmful beasts from the land, and the sword shall not go through your land. You don't have to worry about being invaded. You don't have to worry about being attacked by lions or hyenas or anything like that. I will keep you safe. You shall chase your enemies, and they shall fall before you by the sword. 5 of you shall be able to chase 100 bad guys, and 100 of you shall be able to chase 10,000 bad guys. And all your enemies will fall before you by the sword. And I will turn to you, and I'll make you fruitful and multiply you, and I'll confirm my covenant with you. You'll have great big families, and you'll be healthy, and the disease won't get to you, and everything will be great. Verse 10, you shall eat old store long kept, and you shall clear out the old and make way for the new. And I will make my dwelling among you, and my soul shall not abhor you. And I will walk among you, and will be your God, and you will be my people. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, that you should not be their slaves. And I have broken the bars of your yoke and made you walk upright. God says, all these things I will do for you if you just obey me. Plentiful crops, peace and security, Don't need to worry about the disease and the beasts and all this stuff. Large families, military success. Best of all, he says, I will be with you. I will be your God. I'll walk among you. I'll live with you. We can be together. We'll be joined together. We will be one, and it will be fantastic and wonderful. That's the good side. But there's a downside, isn't there? What happens if they choose not to obey? That's the rest of the chapter. It says, verse 14, but if you will not listen to me, and you will not do all these commandments, if you spurn my statutes, and if your soul abhors my rules, so that you will not do all my commandments, but break my covenant, then I will do this to you. I will visit you with a panic, with wasting disease and fever that consumes the eyes and makes the heart ache. And you shall sow your seed in vain, for your enemies shall eat it. I will set my face against you, and you shall be struck down before your enemies. Those who hate you shall rule over you, and you shall flee when none pursues you. And if in spite of this you will not listen to me, then I will discipline you again sevenfold for your sins, and I will break the pride of your power, and I will make your heavens like iron and your earth like bronze, and your strength shall be spent in vain, for your land will not yield its increase, and the trees of the land will not yield their fruit. Then, if you walk contrary to me and will not listen to me, I will continue striking you sevenfold for your sins. I will let loose the wild beasts against you, which shall bereave you of your children, destroy your livestock, and make you few in number, so that your roads will be deserted. He said traffic jams will not be a problem, because you're all dying off, and there's nobody of you left. Verse 23, and if by this discipline you're not turned to me, but walk contrary to me, then I will also walk contrary to you, and I myself will strike you sevenfold for your sins. I'll bring a sword upon you that shall execute vengeance for the covenant. And if you gather within your cities, I'll send pestilence among you, and you shall be delivered into the hand of the enemy. And when I break your supply of bread, 10 women shall bake your bread in a single oven. Why a single oven? Because their bread loaves are so small they can all fit in one. That's why, because they're all so hungry and they're starving. And you shall dole out your bread again by weight, and you shall eat and not be satisfied. And in spite of this, if you'll not listen to me, then I will walk contrary to you in a fury, and I myself will discipline you sevenfold. You shall eat the flesh of your sons, and you shall eat the flesh of your daughters, because the famine is so severe. And I will destroy your high places, and cut down your incense altars, and cast your dead bodies upon the dead bodies of your idols. And my soul will abhor you, and I will lay your cities waste. I'll make your sanctuaries desolate. I will not smell your pleasing aromas. And I myself will devastate the land, so that your enemies who settle in it shall be appalled at it. And I will scatter you among the nations, and I will unsheath the sword after you, and your land shall be a desolation, and your cities shall be a waste. It says, if you obey me, I will make you prosperous beyond your wildest imagination. But if you disobey me and refuse to do what I'm telling you, I will make you suffer beyond your wildest imagination. You cannot imagine how miserable I will make your life. You'll be in constant famine, constant disease. I'll send the wild animals after you. Your kids, when they go out to milk the cows, they'll be taken by hyenas and wolves and stuff like that. Pestilence, sword, your enemies will overrun you. You'll not get any rain. There'll be constant drought. Finally, I have to exile you out of the land. And things will be so bad that when the enemy comes in and sees the land you're living in, they'll say, ew, what is this forsaken place? This place is horrible. They're probably glad to be exiled because this place is such a dump, because God has punished it so severely, so horribly. And again, I hate to say so, but it's true. We know from biblical history, which side of the chart did they spend most of their time on? They had a few good spots in there. There was a few prosperous times. There really were. And those times were, like you said, amazing beyond their wildest imagination. If you read what life was like under David and Solomon, wowzers, the wealth that they had is just incredible. But after they turned against God, the unbelievable poverty and judgment that God had to bring on them. And he says, these things I will do if you disobey. Sure enough, he did. Well, good news, we made it through Leviticus. You survived. Well done. And more than just being a boring book of regulations, I think we can see a lot of God's character and a lot about us as well, and the relationship between us and God come out through this book, through the laws, through the commands, through the rituals, all the things that we can see ourselves and see God through, and how we can relate to him, how he's a holy God and we are sinful, dirty people, and how we have to have that bridge to come to him, and how fragile that bridge was back in that day before we have the perfect and ultimate solution that we have today. Not an easy system for God to institute among his people, but super, super educational, super informative, super enlightening in terms of who we are and who God is. All right, let's pray and we'll dismiss. Dear God, we thank you for this book that so often we kind of skip over or breeze through without giving another thought, kind of a flyover book in our opinion sometimes. But what a mistake that is, because there's so much here for us to learn about who you are and how you deal with your people.